Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephanie Bree, and it's time for Console Wars Part 8, the handhelds. I'm going to try not to make this one too long, but I got a lot to cover because we've got a lot of handhelds to get through. Because I'm lumping them all together. I'm not breaking them up into different generations because it's too complicated with the handhelds, because there's a lot of wonky overlap with the consoles, and the handhelds are kind of in their own world. Um, so I wrote down a few. I'm not going necessarily in chronological order per se, but they're kind of sort of in chronological order. We're starting in 1989 with the original Nintendo Game Boy. Now, handhelds were an interesting development technologically speaking because they started out even more primitive than home consoles did at the time that they were coming out. Um, but they were more advanced than the initial batch of home consoles. So the earliest handhelds were not as advanced as the consoles that were on the market at the time, but the first handhelds were more advanced than the first consoles, if that makes sense. Now, we're not talking about the standalone plug and play TV game thingies like Virtual Boy and Vectrix and stuff like that, um, because those exist in their own little world, and they were all failures. So none of them were worth talking about in a series called Console Wars because they didn't win shit. Maybe Razzie Awards for being worthless. I don't know. But in 1989, Nintendo set the standard, the gold standard for what a portable handheld gaming device should be. Portable, uh, relatively inexpensive at the time, powered by AA batteries, had a controller built into the console and had a screen built into the console. It was capable of playing original games made for it. It came on interchangeable cartridges. The only drawback, there are a handful of drawbacks with the original Game Boy. One, it's a gigantic piece of plastic, and it's very heavy for like a 6-year-old. But it's still passable. The monochrome screen is a strike against it, considering literally every other handheld on the market at the time as well as since has had full color. And the 4 AA batteries didn't get the best battery life, but not the worst battery life either. And it did come with a shit ton of accessories. Not come with, but there were a shit ton of accessories for it. Fucking link cables and grips and magnifiers and screen lights and fucking digital cameras and printers and microphones and gyroscopes and all kinds of shit. If you can imagine it, Nintendo already did, and they released it for the Game Boy. The Game Boy is, to this day, one of the best-selling handheld game consoles of all time. There's an asterisk. That's because Nintendo counts Game Boy Pocket and Game Boy Color sales in as the Game Boy line, and so it lumps them all together. But realistically, the Game Boy Pocket and the Game Boy Color and the Japan only Game Boy Light, none of them really sold enough to move the needle on their own. So lumping them in with the original Game Boy is still fair because they're all designed like the original Game Boy, and they all play original Game Boy games. And the enhancements you got with the Game Boy Color were only slight enhancements. The rest, I mean, it's pretty much a Game Boy, just finally with a color screen. And some color games, but not very many, and not very many that were any good. Not saying none were, but most weren't. The Game Boy had a lot going for it, especially in the software library. Nintendo themselves produced a lot of Game Boy exclusives. These were games in their primary franchises that were tailor-made for a handheld experience. quick, pick up and play, get through it real quick on a bus ride or a road trip to grandma's or, camping in the woods or whatever, at the lake or whatever, or a long Greyhound bus across the country, whatever. So they did the job. Its immediate competition at launch or near launch was the Atari Lynx, which was the exact opposite of the Game Boy. It did everything wrong. It had interchangeable cartridges, but it was made in like 1990. So think between the NES and the Super NES and around the early Sega Genesis years. So games were already well defined. And its software library were late 70s, early 80s arcade games. So not a very compelling software library. And not a very compelling reason to buy it to get those games, considering that the vast majority of them were available on the Game Boy anyways. So there was no reason to buy an Atari Lynx for those games, because you could just get them on the less expensive Game Boy and play them for a lot longer. Because the Lynx did have a full color screen, but it ate the shit out of the batteries. And it was not a very comfortable console to hold. Its other semi-competition was the Turbo Express, which was literally a handheld that could only play TurboGrafx 16 hue cards, or PC Engine hue cards, or whatever they were called in Japan. It was a portable TurboGrafx 16. Again, which meant you weren't getting handheld games that were tailor-made for the handheld experience. You were getting rubbish TurboGrafx, shitty Nintendo knockoff games on the go. And that was not a very compelling reason to pay $250 for a handheld. Yeah, full color, sure, and could hook up to a TV, I guess, and double as a TurboGrafx 16, but why would you want it? You want to play Bonks? Get it on the NES. I don't know if there was a Bonks on the Game Boy or not, but you could live without Bonks. It was not a system seller, despite what Turbo fans will try their damn hardest until they're blue in the face to convince you they're wrong. They just don't know they're wrong. Not a bad game, but it's not a system seller. No one was ever sitting around saying, oh my god, I can't wait to play Bonk's Adventure. No one. The other semi-competitor to the Game Boy came a little later in its life, was the Sega answer to the Game Boy, the Game Gear, which I believe came out in 92, which was about 2 to 3 years after the Game Boy. The Game Gear, like the Lynx before it, was also full color, and like the Lynx before it, just drank the batteries. And did not get very good battery life, did not sell well, did not have a very good software library, did not have very good accessories to enhance it, and was short-lived for a reason. The next handheld that was sort of a competitor to the Game Boy was the Neo Geo Pocket, which was also monochrome or black and white, but also really crappy ports of Neo Geo games, which you could already get on the Game Boy anyways. So again, not a very compelling reason to buy a Neo Geo Pocket. And then the other pseudo-competitor to the Game Boy was the Sega Nomad, which, like the Turbo Express, was literally just a portable Sega Genesis. And again, full color screen, big bulky monster of a machine, drank the batteries like it was dying of thirst. And while it had the most compelling software library for a handheld at the time in comparison to the Game Boy, compared to its competitors, it was just Genesis games, which again were not designed for pick up and play handheld play. So again, the Game Boy crushed it. So if you're keeping score, there was the Game Boy, and then there was a whole bunch of competition that just came and went, and the Game Boy just kept chugging along. looking back, going, huh, what was that? I don't even know. Nintendo didn't even know it had competition. They were just like, whatever, competition. Pfft, okay, if you say so, buddy. Nintendo next handheld following the Game Boy line, which was I'm including Game Boy Pocket and Color in the Game Boy line because the Pocket came out in I believe 95 and the Color came out I believe in 97 or 98 and was discontinued by like 2001, so it didn't last very long. The Game Boy Color, as a footnote, is just a Game Boy Pocket with full color backlit screen. Not back. No, it was a backlit screen, I believe. Did better on the battery life than the original Game Boy, as did the Pocket. But again, it mostly just played Game Boy games. It played Super Game Boy style enhanced games, meaning it could add color to some Game Boy games. And it also had games that were designed for it that had more colors on it. But again, this is a lot of just Game Boy games that were just re-released with color added a lot of times. So not really a compelling reason to upgrade. So the next handheld is the Nintendo Game Boy Advance, which has two revisions, the Advance SP and the Game Boy Micro. The Game Boy Micro being a footnote in gaming history, not worth a shit, not even worth talking about. The Advance and the Advance SP being the definitive Game Boy products, both capable of playing Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. So once you got to Game Boy Advance or SP, there was no reason to keep your old Game Boys around because you could keep the games around. The Game Boy Advance actually did have compelling games made for it, mostly ports of Super Nintendo games, but were modified slightly to fit the Game Boy, the handheld experience. So they had, mini games added to them to give you the pick up and play functionality that you were craving. But it is unique in that is to the best of my knowledge, the only Nintendo piece of hardware ever released that never had an original Mario title released for it. All of the Mario games that were released for the Game Boy Advance were ports of existing games. You had the Game Boy Advance, the Mario Advance series, which was Super Mario Bros. 2, Super Mario Bros. 3, and Super Mario World. And I believe there was another one, but I think it was it Yoshi's Island, Super Mario Bros. 2. There were 4 Mario Advance games, but I don't remember what the 4th one was. And then there was NES Classic Series, which gave you the original Super Mario Brothers in handheld form, which you could also get on the Game Boy Color and Super Mario Brothers DX or Deluxe, or you could just play the Game Boy version, which was Super Mario Land, which was an original game. I know it's weird. The Game Boy Advance also got a lot of games that were done in the Super Nintendo 16-bit style, but in handheld form. So you had games that existed on the Super Nintendo ported to the GBA, as well as original games that were done in that style, which could have been Super Nintendo games if they were still making Super Nintendo games at the time, or if those games had come out when the Super Nintendo was still a thing. The only competition the GBA had that's worth talking about is the Nokia N-Gage, which really belongs in the mobile gaming console wars video, which is coming later, because it was basically a cell phone that could play video games, but it was not very good. But it was basically GBA level of hardware. So it was like, games that were kind of sort of reminiscent to the GBA, but like I'm pain in the ass to play, so not worth a shit. The next round of handhelds comes via the Nintendo DS and the Sony PSP, Sony's first entry in portable gaming. Now they had the PS1, which you could hook a screen up to it, but it didn't have battery It didn't take batteries. There was no way to make it truly portable. You could plug it into a car adapter and hook it up to your lighter in your car and play it in the car on the go, but you couldn't just like take it to the park. So the PSP was PlayStation Portable was their first handheld. Now, the PlayStation Portable was also the first time Nintendo had legit, real competition in the handheld space. Now, when it was all said and done, the Nintendo DS ran circles around the PSP, but the PSP was the only handheld not made by Nintendo to sell well enough to establish itself in the market as its own legit thing. So I believe it sold over 60 million units worldwide during its lifetime, which is pretty significant. That's about on par with the NES, which was the de facto game console in the late 80s. So enough people bought the PSP to say it was a thing. The DS and the PSP were both followed up, we'll talk about the DS here in a second, by the PS Vita, which was rubbish and not worth mentioning, and the 3DS, which is probably the least interesting handheld Nintendo has ever made. Now, the DS and its successor, the 3DS, what was unique about them is the dual screen. And because the DS was the beginning of the Nintendo Blue Ocean strategy, which you could argue Nintendo was already doing with the Game Boy line anyways, the Nintendo DS got a lot more casual games than what you were used to in a video game library. Now, that's not to say the GBA itself didn't have plenty of casual games. It did, because by and large, handheld games tend to be more casual focused anyways. But the Game Boy also had compelling core gamer games, like Zelda and Metroid and Final Fantasy and the like. While the DS could also play those types of games as well, and it did, it also sold really well because of the casual market. Now, the 3DS, while it was a leg of the casual Blue Ocean strategy, in comparison to the other handhelds, all of them, it was a failure in that it barely got to 70 million units lifetime, which is, like I said, enough, more than the PSP, enough to stand on its own and say, okay, a success in its own world, but compared to all other Nintendo handhelds, which sold 90 plus million units, an ungodly amount of 160 or something million for the DS. No, it was, in comparison to everything else Nintendo did, a failure, but not actually a failure, just not as successful as you would have hoped. And it was a failure in reaching the casual market because it was too goddamn expensive. The DS was $130 retail at launch, and it quickly came down in price. All other Nintendo handhelds were $99 at launch and dropped in price rapidly. The 3DS was $250 at launch, and it never fucking came down in price. It got down to like $180 with the 2DS, which was still more expensive than what people were willing to pay for a handheld. Especially the casual market, who had left the handheld market for the budding mobile market, which we'll talk about in a future video. The last and most recent dedicated handheld hardware released to the video game market is the first one that truly doubles as a home console. That is handheld first, but also works as a home console, but actually works as a dedicated handheld. That's the Nintendo Switch. Its games come on little cartridges. It is fully handheld. It has a shit ton of mobile designed, handheld focused, pick up and play casual games, as well as games that are tailor made for the handheld audience, but also has games that are tailor made for the home console audience. So you got a lot of your core gamer games as well as your casual gamer games, which is, pretty par for the course for a Nintendo handheld, but by far the beefiest and most powerful Nintendo handheld. Now, the whatever the fuck it's called that Sony just released a month ago or 2 months ago is not a true handheld. It's a handheld screen that you can stream PS5 games to. But that's it. It doesn't have its own dedicated software library, and it's not a true handheld. So that's where we are currently. Now, I'm not talking about the Steam box, because I'm putting that under PC gaming, because it's just a portable computer, which is nothing more than a tablet or a laptop. It's all it is. It's a portable computer. It's a gaming focused computer, but it's still a computer. And there are clones of the Steam box, which are basically the same thing. Like, so when it comes to dedicated gaming handhelds, that's the history. Nintendo has basically not even dominated. They've just existed in the handheld market, and everybody else pops in and then pops out for a spell, and then they move on and forget about it. So when we're talking about dedicated handheld gaming, we're talking about Nintendo all day long. Now, whereas I have talked about previously, I became jaded with Nintendo over the years by their console offerings, starting with the N64 and then just going downhill from there. The GameCube being the best thing they've done since the SNES. Their handhelds have always been fucking top notch, and I still own some of their handhelds to this day. I never abandoned Nintendo fully. I just abandoned Nintendo's home console market. But to be fair, Nintendo themselves abandoned the home console market for the handheld hybrid market, which the Switch is a handheld you can hook up to the TV, but because it doesn't have to hook up to the TV and it can exist entirely 100% without hooking up to a TV, it's a handheld that can connect to a TV. And you get slight enhancements if you hook it up to the TV. And it does have the console games. So it is a true hybrid, but it's also a true handheld, which is where Nintendo needed to be following the Wii U. Because the Wii U was the Switch in reverse. It was a handheld. It was a dedicated home console that wanted to be a handheld but wasn't fully portable. Don't get me wrong, I loved the Wii U as a machine, and I loved enough of the Nintendo first-party titles that I was overall satisfied with my Wii U. But as I've said in the past, I was not satisfied enough with the software library to justify paying $400 for it, which I did because I wanted one, and that was the price. That was the asking price. But, to be fair, but the Nintendo has never disappointed me in the handheld market. And like I've said previously, I would still own my Switch. I never would have sold it if I hadn't lost my job and my house and had to sell it because I was going to be homeless and I had to pay rent when COVID took over the world and shut everything down. If that hadn't happened, I would still have a Switch to this day. And if I ever win the lottery or come into some extra money, I may end up with another Switch, or maybe I'll get a Switch 2 Pro or whatever it's called when it comes out. We'll see. Because when we're talking about handheld gaming, we're talking about Nintendo. Everybody else is a footnote in Nintendo's history. Usually something that Nintendo just looked at and said, "Is that the best you can do?" Ha, ha, ha. As they just printed money with their handheld machines.